The rain over Manhattan that autumn night was thin and unhurried, the kind that blurred the city lights into long silver streaks against the windows of the Ashford Tower. Inside the grand ballroom, chandeliers burned gold above rows of black-tie guests, and champagne moved from hand to hand like a current that never stopped. It was the birthday of the most powerful woman in the room, though she had not yet arrived. Somewhere near the far wall, standing apart from the noise, a man in a plain gray suit studied the crowd without seeming to study it at all. Then, without warning, Vivian Ashford crossed the entire floor in 7 quick steps, wrapped her fingers around his arm, and turned to face 200 watching eyes. "Tonight," she said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "pretend to be my fiancé." The music did not stop, but the room did. Nobody in that ballroom knew the man's name. Nobody understood why the city's most guarded executive had chosen him. But before the night ended, that stranger in the ordinary suit would tear apart a conspiracy large enough to swallow an entire empire. Gavin Mercer had walked into the party less than 20 minutes earlier, and already he wished he had stayed home. He was 39 years old, a man who repaired broken companies for a living, and then vanished before anyone learned his first name. 3 days earlier, he had closed out a small manufacturing firm's rebuilding contract, wired his invoice, and planned to spend the weekend alone with a book and a bottle of decent bourbon. Instead, an engraved invitation had arrived at his apartment, addressed in Vivian Ashford's own handwriting, and something about the weight of that card had made refusal feel impossible. He did not attend parties. He avoided rooms exactly like this one, filled with billionaires comparing yachts, senators trading favors behind polite smiles, and bankers who measured a man's worth by the cut of his jacket. Everyone here belonged to someone, to some family name, some inherited fortune, some old money bloodline stretching back 3 generations. Gavin belonged to none of that, and he preferred it that way. A waiter mistook him for a hired assistant and asked him to refill an ice bucket near the bar. Gavin only smiled and pointed toward the actual staff, unbothered. Across the room, Damian Cross noticed the exchange and laughed a little too loudly, nudging the woman beside him. "Security must be getting lazy," Damian said, just loud enough to carry. Gavin heard every word. He said nothing back. He had learned long ago that the quietest man in a room usually understood it best. While the guests drank and postured and traded gossip about mergers and inheritances, Gavin watched the exits, the guarded conversations near the terrace doors, and the tension buried under all that expensive laughter. Something in the building felt wrong, though he could not yet name it. He simply stood near the wall, hands in his pockets, and waited. Then the doors at the top of the staircase opened, and the noise of the entire ballroom dropped by half. Vivian Ashford descended in a black gown that moved like water, her expression composed into the flawless mask the press loved to photograph. She was 37, the chief executive of Ashford Global Holdings, and famous across 3 continents for never once losing her composure in public. Tonight, however, something behind her eyes was different. Gavin noticed it immediately. The way a man notices a hairline crack in a wall he has studied for years. She scanned the crowd once, twice, and then her gaze found him. She walked straight toward him, ignoring every outstretched hand along the way. For a moment, standing near that marble column with the noise of 200 guests swelling behind her, she looked less like the woman who had built an empire, and more like someone counting the exits in a burning building. Gavin recognized that look. He had seen it on the faces of executives moments before their companies collapsed on live television, the particular stillness of a person who has already decided there is no way out and is simply searching for the least painful way through. She reached him and did not slow down. Her fingers closed around his forearm, with a grip far stronger than her delicate wrist suggested. And for one instant, fear flickered across her face before the mask returned. "I need 3 hours," she said quietly, pulling him toward the shadowed edge of a marble column. "That is all. 3 hours, and then you can leave. And never see me again." Gavin studied her for a long moment. 3 hours doing what, exactly? "Pretending," she said. "Pretending to be the man I am marrying." He almost laughed, But something in her voice stopped him. Up close, without the ballroom lights softening her, he could see the exhaustion pressed into the corners of her eyes, the kind that no amount of makeup could fully hide. Her family had spent the entire evening circling her like sharks, scenting blood in the water. And somewhere in that crowd, a board vote was already being counted before it had even happened. "If I do not announce an engagement tonight," Vivian said, her voice dropping lower, "the board will force a vote by Monday morning. They will remove me as chief executive, and a $9 billion merger collapses with me. My mother has already promised half the room that I am marrying Miles Donovan." "I am not marrying Miles Donovan." "Then tell them that." "I have told them that for 2 years." Nobody listens to a woman who says no. They listen to a woman who already belongs to someone else. Gavin studied the ballroom over her shoulder, the sea of watching faces, the calculating tilt of Damien Cross's head near the bar. He understood, in that instant, exactly what she was asking of him, and exactly how much it would cost him to refuse. "Why me?" he finally asked. "You have lawyers, advisors, an entire company of people paid to solve problems like this one." Vivian's grip on his arm tightened, just slightly. "Because I trust you," she said, "and I do not trust anyone else in this building." She did not explain further. There was no time to explain further. The orchestra had already shifted into a lighter tune, signaling that the formal toasts were minutes away. And somewhere near the staircase, Eleanor Ashford was already watching her daughter with the sharp, appraising eyes of a woman who had built and buried 3 husbands of her own. Gavin exhaled slowly. He thought of the empty apartment waiting for him across town, the quiet nights that had become his entire life since his divorce. The years he had spent building a career, out of walking into other people's crises and walking back out before anyone learned to depend on him. He thought about how easy it would be to say no. He said yes instead. Vivian did not thank him. She simply straightened her shoulders, laced her fingers through his, and led him back into the center of the ballroom, as though they had rehearsed the motion 100 times before. The crowd parted instinctively, the way crowds always part for money and power. And when they reached the small raised platform, where the toasts would begin, Vivian lifted her glass and turned to face the entire gathering of the city's most dangerous and beautiful people. "Before anything else tonight," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the marble hall, "I want you all to meet someone important to me." She turned toward Gavin, and for one breath, something almost real passed across her face. "This is my fiancé." The silence that followed was louder than any applause could have been. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Somewhere near the back, a photographer's flash went off twice in rapid succession, capturing the moment before anyone had time to compose themselves for it. Vivian Ashford, the woman who had turned down 3 marriage proposals from men whose families controlled entire industries, was standing beside a stranger nobody recognized, calling him her fiancé in front of the most powerful people in New York. Damien Cross set down his glass slowly, his expression sliding from surprise into something colder and far more calculating. This was not the announcement he had spent months preparing to counter. If Vivian secured her family's approval and locked in her position before the board vote, his entire plan collapsed overnight. He watched Gavin with new interest now, the way a predator watches an unfamiliar animal wander into its territory. Across the room, Miles Donovan's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped visibly beneath his skin. He had spent 18 months courting the Ashford family, dining with Eleanor twice a month, positioning himself as the obvious, inevitable choice. He set down his drink without finishing it, and did not bother hiding his fury as he stared across the ballroom. Eleanor Ashford moved through the crowd like a queen approaching a throne that had just been stolen from beneath her. She reached the couple within seconds, her smile polished and dangerous. "How wonderful," she said, though her eyes told an entirely different story. "And when, exactly, did this happen?" "I do not recall hearing a single word about an engagement. We kept it quiet," Vivian said smoothly. "We wanted one thing in our lives that belonged only to us before the world got involved." "How romantic," Eleanor said, her tone sharpening. And where did he propose? Details matter, darling. People will ask. Gavin felt every eye in a 50-foot radius turn toward him, waiting for the crack in the story that would expose the entire lie. Instead, he simply smiled, unhurried. The same calm expression he wore when walking into a boardroom mid-collapse. A small restaurant on the Lower East Side, he said. No orchestra, no audience. Just the two of us and a table by the window. She said the ring was too much. I told her it was exactly enough. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, searching for the lie and failing to find one. And how long have you known each other? She pressed. 3 years, Gavin answered without hesitation. Long enough to know I did not want anyone else standing beside me tonight. Vivian turned to look at him, and for a fraction of a second, her carefully practiced composure faltered into something genuine. She had expected him to stumble, to hesitate, to require rescuing at any moment. Instead, every answer landed with a precision that unsettled her more than it should have. It was as though he understood pieces of her life that she had never spoken aloud to anyone. Pieces she barely admitted to herself. In the quiet hours before dawn, Eleanor finally allowed a thin, unconvinced smile and drifted back into the crowd, already whispering to 2 of her oldest friends. The immediate danger had passed. But Vivian understood it was only the first wave. Other guests circled at a careful distance, unwilling to approach directly but unable to resist watching. A senator's wife leaned toward her husband and murmured something behind a gloved hand. 2 rival executives, longtime competitors of Ashford Global, exchanged a look that suggested they were already recalculating whatever leverage tonight's chaos might hand them. Gavin felt the weight of every glance and let none of it show on his face. He had built an entire career on the ability to stand inside a hurricane and appear as though the weather had nothing to do with him. Vivian noticed that stillness in him and found herself standing a little straighter because of it, as though some of his calm had quietly become her own. Behind her, Damian Cross had already pulled out his phone and typed a short message to a private investigator he kept on retainer for exactly this kind of emergency. By the time the string quartet resumed playing, Damian had already set his plan into motion. Within the hour, he intended to know everything there was to know about the man now standing beside Vivian Ashford, wearing another man's future like a borrowed coat. The truth of how Gavin Mercer entered Vivian's life traced back 3 years, to a spring evening when Ashford Global Holdings had been 48 hours from a media collapse that could have erased a decade of the company's reputation. A defective product line had triggered a wave of lawsuits, and every major outlet in the country had begun running headlines that painted the Ashford name as reckless and dishonest. The board had panicked. Eleanor had wanted to fire the entire communications team. Vivian, only 34 at the time, and newly appointed as chief executive, had felt the company slipping through her fingers in real time. A colleague had recommended a contractor who specialized in corporate crisis repair. A man who worked quietly, charged enormous fees, and never once appeared in the press coverage of his own successes. Gavin arrived at Ashford Tower that week with 2 assistants, a stack of handwritten notes, and an unshakable calm that Vivian had never encountered in a man twice his seniority. Within 72 hours, he had rebuilt the entire public narrative, secured 3 major retractions, and quietly negotiated a settlement that saved the company nearly $200 million. When the crisis ended, the board offered him a permanent executive position, a corner office, a seat at every future meeting that mattered. Gavin declined without a second thought. Vivian had asked him why, standing alone with him in an empty conference room at 2 in the morning while the rest of the building slept. Because permanence changes people, he had told her. I would rather help and disappear than stay and become something I do not recognize. She had never forgotten that answer. In the years that followed, whenever her life grew too loud, too complicated, too surrounded by people who wanted something from her, she thought of the quiet man who had asked for nothing in return. When the board scheduled tonight's vote and her mother's pressure became unbearable, his name was the only one that came to mind. In the present moment, while string music drifted across the ballroom and champagne refilled itself endlessly, Damian Cross sat in a private office 3 floors above the party, scrolling through a hastily compiled dossier. His investigator had assembled within the hour. Gavin Mercer, contractor. No permanent employer. A pattern of short engagements with major corporations across 5 industries, each one ending abruptly, each one followed by the man vanishing entirely from public record. No consistent address history beyond a modest apartment in Brooklyn. To Damien, that pattern read like something dangerous, something built for deception rather than repair. He printed 3 pages of the file and folded them into his jacket pocket, already imagining how the story would unfold once he revealed it in front of the entire party. A man with no roots, no permanence, no explanation for why he always disappeared right as trust reached its peak. It was, Damien decided, exactly the kind of story that could unravel Vivian's credibility beyond repair. And conveniently, exactly the kind of distraction that would keep every eye in the room away from what Damien himself had spent the last 6 months quietly arranging behind Ashford Global's closed doors. The main screen behind the band flickered to life just as the evening's formal presentation began. Damien had arranged, weeks earlier, for a highlight reel celebrating Vivian's career to play during dinner. And he had used that scheduled slot to slip in 3 additional slides of his own. Photographs appeared first. Grainy images of Gavin standing outside unfamiliar office buildings. Then came scanned documents, contracts bearing dates that overlapped suspiciously, headlines suggesting financial disputes that had never been publicly resolved. Before we continue tonight's celebration, Damien announced, rising from his table with a microphone in hand, I think everyone deserves to know exactly who has been welcomed into this family. His voice carried practiced sincerity, the kind reserved for men who had learned long ago that confidence could disguise almost anything. Because it seems our newest fiancé has quite an interesting history. The room turned toward the screen. Vivian's hand tightened around Gavin's, though her expression remained carefully unreadable. Gavin, however, did not flinch. He studied each slide as it appeared, his eyes moving with the focused precision of a man reading a familiar language, rather than a man caught off guard. That contract, Gavin said calmly, once Damien paused for effect, is dated 3 months after I completed my work with that company. Someone altered the timestamp. He gestured toward the screen without raising his voice. If you compare the font used in the header against the font used in the body text, you will notice they do not match. That document was edited after the fact, likely within the last week. A murmur rippled through the crowd as several guests leaned closer to the projection. And that photograph, Gavin continued, nodding toward the second slide, was taken outside a building I visited exactly once, for a 2-hour consultation with a nonprofit board. The caption claims financial impropriety. I would be happy to provide the actual invoice, which shows I charged nothing for that meeting. Damien's confidence flickered for the first time all evening. These records came from a verified source, he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned considerably. Then your source fabricated them, Gavin replied, unhurried, which raises a more interesting question. Who benefits from convincing this room that I cannot be trusted? On the exact night Vivian needed the room's trust the most, the silence that followed was different from the earlier shock. This silence carried suspicion, and for the first time, it was aimed at Damien rather than at Gavin. Vivian exhaled slowly, relief and disbelief mixing behind her composed expression. She had expected Gavin to survive the evening. She had not expected him to dismantle an attack with such surgical precision, in front of the exact people whose opinions determined her entire career. Before she could speak, however, her phone buzzed silently in her clutch, and the message on the screen drained the color from her face. A major shareholder had just withdrawn preliminary support from the merger vote scheduled for Monday morning, citing what the message called concerning irregularities discovered that evening. Someone, somewhere in that ballroom, was working far faster and far more dangerously than a few doctored photographs. Gavin noticed the shift in Vivian's expression immediately. The flicker of panic beneath her practiced calm. He leaned close enough that only she could hear him. What happened? A shareholder just pulled his support, she whispered. He says he received information tonight. Something about irregularities in our merger paperwork. Who sent it to him? I do not know. Gavin's eyes moved slowly across the ballroom. cataloging faces with the same quiet precision he had used to dismantle Damien's slideshow moments earlier. He watched the way certain guests clustered near the terrace doors. The way one man kept glancing toward his phone every few minutes. The way another excused himself from conversations a fraction too quickly. Crisis work had taught him that panic rarely announced itself loudly. It moved in small, careful gestures, hidden inside ordinary behavior. Within 20 minutes, he had narrowed his suspicion to a single guest standing near the bar. A longtime member of the Ashford board named Richard Halloway, a man who had served the company for nearly 15 years and had never once raised his voice in a meeting. Gavin had read enough financial disclosures over the years to recognize a certain kind of desperation, the kind that came from private debts too large to survive public scrutiny. "It is not Damien," Gavin told Vivian quietly, guiding her a few steps away from the crowd. "Damien wants power, but he wants it in daylight, with his name attached. Whoever leaked information to your shareholder tonight wants money, and wants to remain invisible. That is a different kind of danger." "Who, then?" "I need another hour to be certain. Until then, we keep playing our roles. If whoever is behind this believes the engagement story is working, they will assume the board still favors you. That buys us time." Vivian studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes that had nothing to do with fear. She had built her entire career on trusting no one completely, on assuming every ally carried a hidden motive. Yet here was a man asking her to trust him with the single most vulnerable night of her professional life. And every instinct she possessed told her to say yes. "All right," she said finally. "We finished the night as planned." They returned to the crowd together, hand in hand, smiling at exactly the right moments, answering exactly the right questions, giving no indication that beneath the surface of their performance, an entirely separate battle had already begun. Gavin excused himself twice during the following half hour, disappearing briefly into a quiet hallway to make 2 short phone calls to contacts he trusted from previous crisis work, contacts capable of tracing financial transactions faster than any internal Ashford audit team could manage on a Saturday night. By the time he returned to the ballroom the second time, he carried the beginning of a very different picture, one involving offshore accounts, a series of unusual wire transfers, and a name that would soon change the entire trajectory of the evening. Vivian watched him move through the crowd during that half hour, greeting old acquaintances with the same warmth he had shown all night, betraying nothing of the storm he was quietly assembling behind his calm expression. She thought of every crisis she had faced in 11 years as an executive, the sleepless nights, the boardrooms full of men who doubted her before she said a single word, the endless calculation required just to be taken seriously. She had learned to survive by trusting almost no one completely. Watching Gavin work that night, piecing together a conspiracy with nothing but a phone, 2 contacts, and an unshakable patience, she understood she was witnessing something she had rarely been given the chance to witness in her entire career, a person choosing to help her not because it benefited him, but simply because she had asked. By 10 o'clock, the celebration had quietly transformed into something closer to a crisis meeting. 3 major investors, alarmed by the earlier withdrawal of shareholder support, requested a private conversation with Vivian before the night ended, unwilling to let rumors fester until Monday morning. Eleanor insisted the meeting happen immediately. In the private study, 1 floor above the ballroom, away from cameras and curious guests. Vivian agreed, and to the visible surprise of everyone present, she asked Gavin to join her. The study filled quickly. Eleanor sat rigid near the fireplace, her expression unreadable. Damien arrived moments later, still shaken from his failed slideshow, clearly uncertain of his footing. 2 investors took the leather chairs near the window, their patience visibly thinning with every passing minute. Somewhere near the back of the room, Richard Halloway lingered by the door, arms crossed, saying nothing. "Explain the irregularities," one investor said flatly, addressing Vivian directly, "because right now, I am hearing about compromised financial statements attached to a merger I am expected to approve within 72 hours. Gavin stepped forward before Vivian could respond, opening a slim folder he had assembled during his brief absence earlier that evening. "There are no irregularities in the merger paperwork," he said calmly. There is, however, a pattern of unauthorized wire transfers dating back 4 months, routed through 3 shell accounts registered outside the country. Someone with internal access has been quietly diverting funds and covering the gap by manipulating quarterly figures just enough to avoid triggering an automatic audit. The room went still. Eleanor's composed expression cracked for the first time all night. That is a serious accusation, she said sharply. Damien shifted near the window, his earlier confidence entirely gone now, replaced by the uneasy stillness of a man realizing he had walked into a room far more dangerous than the one he had prepared for. He had spent the evening trying to expose Gavin as a fraud, never once suspecting that the true danger to Ashford Global had been sitting quietly on the board for 15 years, hidden behind a reputation nobody had thought to question. One of the investors muttered something under his breath about auditors who had clearly missed far more than a clerical error, and Eleanor's eyes flicked toward Richard with a slow, dawning suspicion she could no longer dismiss as impossible. It is a documented one, Gavin replied, sliding copies across the table. Every transaction traces back to a single authorization code, a code that only a handful of people within this company possess. One investor leaned forward, scanning the pages with growing alarm. This explains the discrepancy our own analysts flagged last week, he muttered. We assumed it was a clerical error. It was designed to look like one, Gavin said. Whoever engineered this counted on nobody looking closely enough, especially during a week when the entire company's attention would be focused on tonight's celebration and tomorrow's merger vote. Vivian watched him work with something close to awe. She had built companies, restructured departments, negotiated deals worth more money than most nations' annual budgets. Yet she had never witnessed anyone dismantle a crisis with such calm, methodical precision, layering evidence the way a surgeon layers incisions, careful, deliberate, never wasting a single motion. In that study, surrounded by the very people who held her career in their hands, she finally understood that the man she had asked to play her fiancé for 3 hours had quietly become the only person in the building she trusted without hesitation. Gavin turned the final page of his folder and looked directly at Richard Holloway, still standing near the door with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. The authorization code traces to an account created under board access privileges, Gavin said. Only 6 people currently hold that level of clearance. 5 of them are standing in this room right now, and their financial records show no unusual activity. The 6th authorized the transfers from a private terminal registered to his home address 3 separate times over the past 4 months. Richard's arms slowly uncrossed. This is absurd, he said, though his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. I have served this board for 15 years. You have, Gavin agreed. 15 years, and a mortgage on a property in the Hamptons that exceeds your declared salary by a considerable margin, along with 2 failed private investments that became public record 8 months ago. People under that kind of financial pressure make decisions they would never otherwise consider. The silence in the study grew unbearable. Eleanor rose from her chair, her earlier hostility toward Gavin dissolving into something closer to disbelief. She had spent the entire evening searching for the flaw in this stranger's story, certain he was hiding something far worse than financial desperation. Instead, he had uncovered the actual threat hiding inside her own boardroom, a threat none of her trusted advisors had noticed in 4 months of quiet theft. Damien, still standing near the window, felt the full weight of his earlier miscalculation settle over him. He realized, with growing unease, that his own investigator's dossier on Gavin had likely been fed false information deliberately, planted by someone who wanted attention, focused on a fabricated scandal, while the real conspiracy continued unnoticed. He had been used as a distraction, a loud, confident puppet dancing exactly where someone else needed him to dance. Richard finally broke, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of exposure. He admitted everything in a low, defeated voice: the debts, the desperation, the offer from a rival firm that had promised to erase his financial troubles in exchange for quietly sabotaging the Ashford merger from the inside. Security arrived within minutes to escort him from the building, his 15 years of board service ending in a hallway lined with photographs celebrating the very company he had nearly destroyed. He did not look back as the elevator doors closed, and nobody in the study offered him the courtesy of watching him go. The two investors who had demanded answers less than an hour earlier now regarded Vivian with an entirely different expression, something closer to respect than suspicion. One of them, a silver-haired man who had sat on 3 separate boards over the course of his career, turned to Gavin with open curiosity. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced," he said. "Most consultants I know would have needed a week and a team of forensic accountants to find what you found tonight in under 2 hours. Most consultants are looking for the wrong thing," Gavin replied simply. "They look for what changed. I look for who benefits from nobody noticing." The investor studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, the kind of nod that in rooms like this one counted as genuine praise. Eleanor turned to Vivian, her expression softer than it had been in years. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I doubted you tonight in front of everyone. I should not have." Her eyes shifted briefly toward Gavin. "And I owe you something as well, though I am not entirely certain what to call it yet." Across the room, Miles Donovan had already slipped quietly out through the side door sometime during the confrontation, his earlier hopes for a strategic marriage dissolving into the same fine autumn mist falling outside the tower's windows. Nobody noticed him leave. Nobody, that night, cared. By the time the guests began filtering out of the ballroom below, the crisis had resolved itself with a speed that left everyone slightly breathless. The withdrawn shareholder reinstated his support within the hour, satisfied by the documented evidence and the swift removal of Richard Halloway from the board. The merger, once teetering on the edge of collapse, now appeared more secure than it had been in weeks. Vivian stood near the tall windows of the study long after the others had gone, watching rain trace slow paths down the glass, the city lights blurring gold and white beyond it. Gavin found her there, his jacket slightly rumpled from a night that had asked far more of him than 3 quiet hours. "You do not need me to keep performing anymore," he said gently. The board saw what they needed to see. "Your position is safe." "I know," Vivian said, not turning around. "You can go, if you want. I imagine you would rather be anywhere else right now." He almost agreed. He almost reached for his coat and walked out the way he had walked out of 100 other crises, quietly, without ceremony, before anyone had the chance to depend on him too deeply. Instead, he found himself still standing there, unwilling to leave the room just yet. Vivian finally turned to face him, and for the first time all evening, the careful composure she wore like armor had fully disappeared. "I have wanted to call you for months," she admitted, "long before tonight. Long before any board vote or merger deadline. I kept finding reasons not to. I told myself it was inappropriate, that reaching out for anything beyond business would complicate things I could not afford to complicate. And tonight, I ran out of other options," she said, a faint, tired smile crossing her face. "I told myself I only needed an actor for 3 hours. I think I always knew that was not entirely true." Gavin studied her for a long moment. The woman who commanded boardrooms and silenced skeptical investors with a single sentence. Standing before him now with nothing performed, nothing rehearsed, nothing hidden behind strategy. He thought of the empty apartment waiting for him across the city. The quiet, careful distance he had maintained from nearly everyone since his divorce years earlier, the discipline he had built around never letting anyone matter enough to disappoint him. "I have spent a long time making sure nobody gets close enough to need me," he said quietly. "It is easier that way. Fewer people to disappoint. And tonight?" He allowed himself something rare, a genuine smile, unguarded and slow. "Tonight I am finding that easier does not always mean better." Vivian crossed the small distance between them, and for once in her exceptionally controlled life, she did not calculate the next move. She simply reached for his hand, the same hand she had gripped earlier in front of 200 strangers as part of an elaborate lie, and found that it no longer felt like a lie at all. Rain continued to fall softly against the tall windows, and somewhere far below, the last of the guests trickled out into cars waiting along the wet street. Neither of them moved to turn on the lights. For a long while, They simply stood together in that quiet study. Two people who had spent the entire evening performing certainty for a room full of strangers, finally allowing themselves the uncertainty of something real. Vivian thought of every carefully worded statement she had rehearsed for tonight, every contingency she had prepared for 100 different disasters, and realized that none of it had accounted for this, a stillness that asked nothing of her at all. Gavin thought of every project he had walked away from without looking back, every door he had closed quietly behind him before anyone could ask him to stay, and understood, standing there, that he no longer wanted to close this one. 3 weeks passed before the merger officially closed, sealing Ashford Global Holdings' place at the center of one of the largest corporate partnerships completed that year. The board, humbled by how close they had come to losing everything through their own blindness, unanimously reaffirmed Vivian's position as chief executive, this time without a single dissenting voice in the room. Richard Holloway's case moved quietly through the legal system, a private matter handled far from the cameras that had once threatened to expose Vivian's company to public ruin. Damian Cross, chastened by his own miscalculation, resigned from his position within the month, choosing to rebuild his reputation elsewhere, rather than remain in a building that now recognized exactly how easily he had been manipulated. Eleanor Ashford, in the weeks that followed, stopped mentioning arranged marriages entirely. She invited Gavin to dinner twice, both times without an agenda, both times ending in long conversations about business, about family, about the kind of quiet strength she had spent years failing to recognize in her own daughter. She never apologized outright for doubting Vivian so publicly, but her actions afterward spoke clearly enough for anyone paying attention. Ashford Global's stock steadied within days and climbed steadily through the following weeks, buoyed by news of the merger's successful completion and by a wave of quiet admiration from investors who had watched Vivian handle the crisis without a single misstep once the truth came to light. Financial columnists who had spent years questioning whether a woman so young could hold together an empire that size wrote instead about her composure under pressure, about the swift, decisive way she had removed a corrupt board member without a hint of public scandal touching the company's name. None of them knew the full story behind that composure, how much of it had been built quietly and unexpectedly, alongside a man nobody in that ballroom had recognized at the start of the night. Gavin, for the first time in years, did not disappear once the crisis ended. He kept his small apartment in Brooklyn, kept his quiet habits, kept the careful independence he had built for himself over a decade of solitude. But he no longer vanished the moment a job was finished. He stayed in the city. He returned Vivian's calls the same day they came. He learned, slowly and without fanfare, that choosing to remain somewhere did not have to mean losing himself in the process, a lesson he had spent years avoiding without ever admitting it to anyone, least of all himself. On a bright afternoon, nearly a month after the party, Vivian stood before a room full of journalists for a scheduled press conference addressing the successful merger. Questions about quarterly earnings and market strategy dominated the first 20 minutes, until one reporter near the back raised her hand with a different kind of question entirely. "There were rumors circulating after your birthday celebration last month," the reporter said, "about a surprise engagement announcement. Was that story ever confirmed? Or was it simply a rumor that got out of hand?" The room fell quiet, dozens of cameras angling slightly toward Vivian's face, waiting for her practiced, careful answer. Instead, she glanced toward the side of the room, where Gavin stood near the doorway, having accompanied her that morning at her own invitation rather than out of any professional obligation. "It was not entirely true," Vivian said, a small, honest smile breaking through her composed expression. "That night, it started as something else, a favor between two people who trusted each other more than either of us realized." She paused, and the room leaned in closer. "But things change. People change, sometimes faster than they expect." She crossed the small distance toward Gavin and reached for his hand exactly the way she had reached for it that rainy autumn night. Except this time nothing about the gesture was performed. "So if you are asking whether it is true now," she said, looking directly into the cameras, "then yes, it is." Gavin said nothing, offering only a quiet, unguarded smile, the same one he had given her weeks earlier in an empty study overlooking a rain-soaked city. He had spent years building a career out of walking into other people's chaos and disappearing before anyone learned to rely on him, protecting himself from every possibility of disappointment by never allowing anyone close enough to cause it. That night at the party had asked him to pretend, for 3 brief hours, to be something he was not. Instead, it had shown him something he had spent years avoiding without realizing it. The simple, terrifying possibility of choosing to stay. When the press conference ended and the cameras finally lowered, Vivian and Gavin walked together down the same marble steps where the rain had once fallen so quietly on the night everything began. The storm outside had long since passed, and above the towers of Manhattan, the sky had cleared into a wide, endless blue, stretching over a city that had no idea what it had just witnessed. A man who had spent his whole life disappearing quietly, finally choosing, for the first time, to stay.